Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about belief without evidence. Now, as a follow-up to the videos I did last week on ontological arguments where I talked about Anselm's argument and modal ontological arguments, I wanted to evaluate some of the epistemology that really thinks about things a priori, that is, beliefs without evidence, beliefs without sense experience. And the nature of ontological arguments is that they employ epistemology in these means, but I generally reject the ontological arguments because they make assertions about the actual world without actually touching the actual world, which I think is a bad epistemology. However, I don't think the conversation is over at that. I think there's a lot more we can talk about with this in regards to Christian thought and the kinds of beliefs that one might have in light of a priori thought and what one can believe and can't believe and so on as it relates to beliefs without evidence. Before we get carried away in the conversation, let's start with the idea of a basic belief. A basic belief is a belief not contingent on other beliefs. Now, this is a fairly uncontroversial idea here. If I have a belief that is the most foundational belief, it's what I'd consider a basic belief, and I can build other beliefs on top of that. Now, the next one that is an extension of this idea is something called a properly basic belief. And this idea says that a belief is a rational belief in the absence of evidence and arguments. Now, this is a special set of basic beliefs that one can have and still be considered rational, even if one doesn't have evidence and arguments for that. And that's a fairly contentious idea in and of itself, which is what we're going to be diving into for the remainder of this video. Consider the idea of 2 + 2 = 4. This is a mathematical proposition that I don't need to prove out and I don't need evidence for. So this would be a properly basic belief. However, if I said dragons exist, I would need some kind of evidence to show this to be true. So the idea of a claim that dragons exist would not be a properly basic belief. Now, there are some beliefs that are fairly uncontroversial that most people would argue I don't need evidence for, I don't need argument for, and that would be things like mathematics and logic, which we've already seen an example of. The idea that I exist, I don't need evidence for my existence, or I don't need to argue for my own existence. Third, I don't need to argue that I wasn't created 5 minutes ago with the illusion of memory. I have memories that are reliable and I can trust them without the need to argue for their validity and so on. That would be a properly basic belief. And fourth, that my senses are working properly, that I don't need to prove that my eyes are working properly or that my smell is working properly. I don't need to prove that I'm not a brain in a vat and that I'm being fed in stimuli by some evil scientist. These kinds of ideas I don't need to assert with argument or evidence to be rational in believing, and I think the same could be said for everybody else out there, that they don't need to argue for these things in terms of evidence or arguments for them. These are held as properly basic beliefs without evidence, without argument. Two more controversial areas that one might consider to be properly basic would be things like morals. Are my morals something that I consider to be properly basic, or is that something I need evidence and arguments for? I'm not going to get into this today, but it's one of those areas that is hotly debated as being properly basic or not being properly basic. And another one would be, do other minds exist? And the reason why this subject comes up is I can perceive that I see a person and they are interacting with me, but I cannot prove with any kind of evidence or argument that it's not just some kind of automaton, rather they are really indeed another mind that I am actually interacting with. So this idea of do other minds exist? Am I rational in believing that as a properly basic belief? Thirdly, there is the idea of God. Is belief in God a properly basic belief? It's on this idea where I want to camp out for the remainder of this video, because this is one of the most controversial in this list, and it's been the topic of conversation among theistic thinkers as well as atheistic thinkers as to really, can one believe in God without evidence and without argumentation to support that belief? The movement in Christian thought that wants to show that God is a properly basic belief is called Reformed Epistemology, and its primary proponent is Plantingas. And this work started about 4 decades ago in a book that Plantingas wrote, and is basically asserting that belief in other minds is rationally warranted and properly basic. So we've already seen that in the last list I gave. And built on the top of that idea, Plantinga argues that God could be properly basic. So defined, Reformed epistemology could be essentially that. Belief in God may be properly basic and not need to be inferred from other truths to be rationally warranted. Plantinga's project starts with a critique of foundationalism. Now, foundationalism is an epistemic framework that attempts to put things into three different categories. First, it says there are self-evident beliefs, and this would be things like math and logic. 2 + 2 = 4 is true in and of itself and doesn't need any external proof or evidence to be shown that way. Second, there are incorrigible truths. An example of this would be Descartes' maxim where he says, I think, therefore I exist. The act of thinking shows that this is true, and so this is why we call it incorrigible and not self-evident. It's the act of thinking that shows it rather than just being true in and of itself. And then thirdly, there's a category of beliefs that touches on the senses, which is when something is evident to the senses. Now, this would be anything I can gain through the experience of the world, such as seeing the sky is blue or saying dragons exist. Both those statements require that I observe something, and those such statements would then be evident to my senses. In one case, I can observe the sky is blue by looking out, but I've never seen dragons, so I wouldn't be rational in saying that because I have no evidence to support that belief. Foundationalism, as critiqued by Alvin Plantinga, has two problems. First, he argues that many of us have beliefs we cannot justify. For instance, if I say I love my wife and then somebody asks me to prove it, how would I prove that to be true? I have really no good way of doing that. So that's why he says that I would be irrational under foundationalism for making that claim. Second, Plantinga argues that foundationalism is not consistent with itself. He argues that it is neither self-evident, it's neither incorrigible, nor is it evident to the senses. So because it doesn't meet its own criterion, it's not something that one can really vouch for or hold to because it isn't self-consistent. Plantinga argues for the properly basicness of God from the idea of sensus divinitatis, or the sense of God. Now, this is a reformed idea from John Calvin, where he says that in every person there is a sense of God that can produce belief in God. Now, Plantinga says so long as one's mental faculties are working properly and one has this sense of God within them, then one would be rationally justified in believing in God, independent of argument or independent of evidence to that belief. So, in other words, belief in God would then be properly basic because of this. One of the first objections that is often raised to this stems from religious pluralism. Now, religious pluralism, you could say, don't competing religious experiences show that anything is justifiable? Really, are we just playing religious roulette and one can justify pretty much any belief that he wants to based on some sense for whatever deity he or she prefers? To this, Alvin Plantinga might argue that competing truths don't invalidate actual true beliefs. In other words, one's belief in Allah does not show that my belief in Jesus is contradictory. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Competing truths don't necessarily defeat one another. Rather, then he follows this by saying that defeaters can show logical inconsistencies in worldviews. So when one has a belief, one can show another person's beliefs to be inconsistent or really show by proof of contradiction that given belief wouldn't be rationally valid because there is some kind of logical inconsistency within that worldview. And so from these two objections to religious pluralism, Alvin Plantinga argues that religious pluralism itself is not sufficient reason to reject Reformed epistemology. Now, while I don't have any problems with Reformed epistemologies per se, I do have some problems with the critique of foundationalism. One, foundationalism is useful for showing defeaters. As a framework, it's a very powerful epistemic tool that can show that there are issues in other worldviews based on some of the principles of foundationalism. Second, I'm not so sure that foundationalism isn't self-evident or incorrigible. One could argue for its self-evidence by showing that there are, among the three options of justification, infinite regress, circularity, or just brute facts in many ways, that the two of those result in absurdities. It's so the only one that's left, in a sense, a basic belief, that would be in support of foundationalism could show that foundationalism is self-evident. It could also be shown that it's incorrigible by simply showing that the person that has some kind of belief in believing that and basing other beliefs on it shows foundationalism to be true. So it is consistent with its own criterion concerning self-evidence and incorrigibility. Third, foundationalism is consistent with the sensus divinitatis because the third kind of thing that is available in foundationalism is something that is evident to the senses. Now, if the sense of God is one of those senses, then one would be rational in believing in the existence of God under the foundationalist framework based on the sensus divinitatis. So I don't think it's necessary to create a new epistemic framework and appeal to a sense of the divine in that framework when it fits well within the idea of foundationalism. And fourth, pragmatism offers a solution to ambiguity. Now, one of the main reasons that Alvin Plantinga goes for the idea of Reformed epistemology is because he's not so convinced that the positive arguments for the existence of God, such as ontological arguments, cosmological arguments, and teleological arguments, really produced a sound case for God. So he says, in light of that, one doesn't need argumentation for these things in order to be rational in their belief in God. Well, pragmatism, such as in the form of Pascal's wager, can deal with some of the ambiguities. Now, Pascal's wager is a whole other can of worms, which I do plan to explore in the future, but these kinds of pragmatic approaches to truth can offer some ways to deal with ambiguity in light of the inability of arguments to produce a sound case for the existence of God. While I'm really not a big proponent of Reformed epistemology, I don't really find any major problems with it. However, I'm not going to commit to it myself because I don't believe that I need to in light of some other things I've mentioned. Foundationalism, I think, provides a nice framework for beliefs as well as other things. Second, I think there are evidential arguments that one can propose for the existence of God. And thirdly, I think there are pragmatic ways to handle such things. But I'm not going to be a opponent of Reformed epistemology either. But considering that there are beliefs without evidence, I think that one can say that this is true, such as mathematical beliefs, belief that I exist, and some of the other examples I did mention. So evidence is not required for all beliefs, but in many cases those a posteriori beliefs are such beliefs that I do need evidence for. And I think that is where I'm going to go next, where I explore some positive arguments for God's existence and really look at evidence-based reasoning for showing how one might come to belief in God. And these would be teleological and cosmological arguments, and I'm going to do an assessment of many of these that are out there circulating in Christian thought. If you like this content, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and then clicking on the bell icon to receive notifications when new content becomes available. You can also follow us on Twitter @AbideDevo. And as always, thank you for watching.